Good evening. Hello. Thanks for coming to the first FedTalks of 2016. For those that don't know, we have 4 events a year. 3 of them are kind of like this, a conversation, and entry by donation. And once a year we do a fundraiser so that we can do them entry by donation. So look out for our event in May the 21st, Saturday night, in here. You'll all hear about it. You can find out about it on our Facebook, our webpage, or you can sign up the back for email contacts. Other events around Federal and around this type of thing. This Wednesday night is the first in a new series down in Mullum called Politics in the Pub, which is on the 4th Wednesday of every night. If you came, of every month, of every night. If you came to FedTalks about a year ago, you would have heard a talk we did on activism with Aidan Ricketts and someone from the New Democracy movement out of Sydney. Well, they're having a similar talk this Wednesday in Politics in the Pub, so with Aidan. So if you'd like to take that conversation further, 7 o'clock at the Courthouse Hotel in Mullum. And then, if you've still got stamina, this Friday at the Drill Hall in Mullum, there's a documentary called Black Hole, which is a fundraiser for Quorum, another local sustainability-based group happening in Mullumbimby. And then if you love Federal, which I know you all do, on the 5th of March, which is Saturday week, there's a comedy night in the hall with Mandy Nolan. And Federal Loves Refugees are doing the catering to raise money to host refugees that are based in Brisbane in the community around Federal. So lots happening. A yellow Mitsubishi has left their lights on. We won't watch who gets up. And I want to thank the FedTalks people for getting it together. We're all volunteers, and thank you to everyone, especially to Peter and Francesca, who do the coffee and tea for us every time we do an event. So thank you. And thanks to Susanna Freymark, who's going to host this evening. She's a local journalist and author and is doing this for us, and I'm going to hand over to her now to introduce the speakers.
Thanks, Alan. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land, first up, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Welcome to Federal Hall. We are at this lovely little retro kitchen table that feels like, Alan, we should have little cups of tea and one of those cake stands. But there you go. We like to keep it simple in Federal. Now tonight, I don't want to put pressure on our 2 guests, but I think you're in for a bit of a treat. Okay. I know, there's a bit of pressure, but, you know, I have faith in you. On my left, we've got Cathy Burke, who has many strings to her bow. And around Federal, Cathy and her husband Steve were the first people I met when I came to Federal. But I very rarely get to see Cathy on the world stage, so to speak. I see her slumming around Federal when she's come out of Upper Coopers Creek Valley. So she does a lot of her work overseas. And her book that came out last year called Unlikely Leaders is a great read and some fantastic, humbling stories in it. And it gave me a greater understanding of what you actually do after reading that, which was fantastic. So she is still CEO of the Hunger Project in Australia, but soon to take on a new role with global partnerships. But I'll let her tell us more about that. And to my right, I have Professor Baden Offord, who most of you may know from Southern Cross University, but he now flits between here and Western Australia, where he is at Curtin University. So unless we lock him in the cupboard, he'll be going back there. And of course, he's written a lot about human rights. And one thing, whenever I've heard Baden speak, I don't think I've ever met a person who can bring so much compassion to everything he speaks about. So that's the 2 guests. And the first question I want to ask you both, and I'll ask Cathy first, is who or what has inspired you in terms of leading a life where social activism is to the fore?
Hi everybody, good to see lots of people here that I know, and I know there's a few people at the front and I can be heckled, so I'll just let you know that if you heckle me, that's fine. who has inspired me the most to get involved? Probably when I was a young woman, I'm a Perth girl originally before we moved here in 1998, and I got involved in social justice politics, and the woman who really spearheaded that in Perth her name is Jo Valentine, and she was an independent senator for nuclear disarmament, and in 1984, it was well before I met her, she was really concerned about the nuclear issue, and she heckled, actually, Bob Hawke in Perth about nuclear submarines, and he basically heckled her back and said, well, who are you going to vote for? And she thought, stuff that, you'll vote for me. And she set herself up in 1984 and won a Senate seat. And in 1987, I was asked to run a key part of her re-election campaign. And I was a young ex-nightclub runner, rock and roll band tourer, misfit. But she really inspired me to sort of take that stand and have a go. And then as a result of that, we then set up the Greens Party in WA, and I was part of about 7 people that did that. And she was able to then move into that space, and we have now a really great legacy of Greens politics as a result of that. But I saw the cost for her. She had a young family at the time, and she was considered really unpopular, and there's a lot of sort of gender-based attacks, verbal attacks and misrepresentation of her, but she had incredible values, and she was just amazing. So she really inspired me to move out of my world of superficiality and rock and roll into making a difference.
Thank you, Cathy. And Baden, who was it for you?
Oh, who? That's a very difficult question to answer, actually, Susanna. And for me, there are lots of people, I would say, that have been very significant in understanding social justice issues. I was very much a late bloomer in terms of coming to social justice and the sort of things we're talking about tonight in terms of activism in many ways. So I was a really late bloomer. And we may come back to that sort of question, because I think you're going to ask us about that sort of story. But if I was to think about who really did, there's a couple of people, particularly in my career and my work, my life, have really inspired me. And they wouldn't like the word inspired so much either, by the way. It's a very interesting term. But one of them, I was living in India in the 1980s, and one of our neighbours was an Indian fellow called Achut Pat Warden, and he was in his 80s, and he was one of Mahatma Gandhi's kind of co-independence fighters. So for those of you who know the Indian independence kind of movement, he was one of those fellows who for 2 years helped to blow up train lines and stuff like that, not killing people, but he was part of that sort of anti-violence, that sort of non-violent response to the British and so on. And he was our neighbour, and I was in my 20s, late 20s, and we used to have afternoon tea with him every week, and he was the person that sort of, in a sense, he founded the Socialist Party of India in 1920-something or other, and he'd become interested in the philosophy of Jiddu Krishnamurti, some of you may have heard of. And so he was this really radical kind of politician. And for an Australian kid who came from Sydney at that time, suburban Sydney, with a very square notion, ending up in India, which is a completely different experience as we know, I basically found his particular viewpoint about what activism and what social justice was fascinating, because he talked about the mind being the source of the revolution that we needed to have. So from a very early age, from the age of my 20s, I started to sort of think about, in a sense, social justice issues in terms of the connection between my within and my without, my relationship, I suppose, between my own life and does it match the reality of what I do in my other life. The second person, if I may just take that very briefly, was Desmond Tutu. So during my PhD, I was very lucky to interview him in Sydney. And again, spent a morning with this guy, and of course he just finished the, was post-apartheid. He was interested particularly in the sort of work that Cathy does in her role and her work, and has done for a long time now, about ending poverty and tackling hunger. And Desmond Tutu, and I was very nervous, by the way, that's another story, but I was sitting on a couch with Desmond Tutu doing a PhD project and felt very strange. But he said, he talked about this thing, this notion of Ubuntu and this notion of how we see humanity through our relationship with others. So what's inspired me to become interested in social justice in some ways is a very round, it's taken lots of different turns. And so those two particularly I still draw on for the kind of way that I approach human rights, the way I approach thinking about what it means to be a human being and what it means for us to be in this environment, this planet and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Baden. What I'd like you to do now is, we are going to have a Q&A at the end of our talk, but what I'd like you to do is to think about the person or event. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person, but the person or thing that has inspired you to take action. And I'd like you to turn to the person next to you and tell them about that, and then listen to theirs. We're going to give you 5 minutes. So what or who has inspired you to take action? Cathy. Are you close enough? Yeah, we're going to get to that. I am going to talk.
Okay, you can just a bit closer.
I had a beer.
Oh, I'm sure I don't want to. So you do this so they
So I bought a bottle of wine at the birthday. And then we went there and tasted it and drinks. Yeah, I know it. It's good. It's great.
Make sure you've both had a turn at speaking.
So what's your new job?
Okay, another minute and then we're going to wrap you up.
Oh, them. Those are catching up.
Do you see where?
Okay, if you can, we can have your attention back to the front, please. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe we can share some of those stories later. Now, one of the people that has inspired me very late in life was Fran Peavy, who wrote the book Heart Politics Revisited. And one of the things she did, which I thought was amazing, was she used to go onto the streets of Canada and America and hold up a big sign saying, willing to listen. And that was her form of activism. She did lots of other things, but that was the one that struck me. So one of the questions I wanted to put to you too was, can activism be as simple as that, or am I making something complex too simple, that holding up a sign saying willing to listen and doing that with strangers, which she had some interesting results, is it just too simple, or is that okay? Who'd like to jump in first?
The professor.
Cathy, just because I'm a professor doesn't mean I know anything, okay? So
Believe me, she
that.
had her tongue in her cheek when she said professor.
Cathy knows that. Yeah, do you want me to start?
Yeah, why not? I don't have an answer.
Stop being so polite, you two.
Okay, so, look, activism to me is a very important and very powerful thing to think about, because what do we mean by activism, in fact? And this is a really good question, Susanna. And I've thought about this since Alan sent us these emails, and then Susanna asking us these questions, and then for Cathy and I to think about this. What does it really mean to be an activist? Because for me, it means so many different things, and I think it means not just obviously. It doesn't mean holding. I went to a talk by Arundhati Roy when she received the Peace Prize, Sydney Peace Prize. Under Arundhati Roy, she wrote that fantastic book, and she said in her talk, she said that she wasn't an activist at all. And she'd been doing all this stuff against the Narmada dams and these terrible things that were happening in India at the time. And she said, I'm not an activist at all. And I wrote something later about that particular talk she gave, and because I think she is an activist, obviously. And I think this is a really interesting question. What do we mean by activism? What do we mean in this area? There's an awful lot of debate and thought and creativity about what it might mean to be an activist. So the question for me is, what does an activist mean? As I said to you a little bit earlier, I came to this whole thing in a very roundabout way, later in my life. So I came from a very dysfunctional family, a Maori Pakeha family, migrated to Sydney in 1960. The White Australia policy was still there. The neighbours next door in our suburban house were Norm and Norma and Wayne and Warren. Who both surfed, and I grew up in that kind of surfing culture, and I loved Norma and borrowed lots of sugar and ice cream from them. But my father was very evidently Maori, and we had a lot of problems. My father took his life when I was on my 19th birthday in Bondi. My brother has since taken his life. I tried to take my life. My mother, my sister, the whole of my siblings, we all tried to take our lives. Some of us, and I'm the last man in my family, the last male of my immediate family. And if I look back to some of the pictures of my intergenerational, those pictures you've got, I've got this amazing picture at home in Ocean Shores, which shows my great-grandfather, who was basically a full-blood Maori, with his Norwegian wife. How's that for a combination? And they had 10 children, and one of them was my grandmother. And when we did some digging about the sort of story of my family, a lot of the males in that family, the intergenerational trauma, which for me comes from that colonial thing, just as it affects Indigenous Australia, as we all know, so powerfully, a lot of the males in my cousins and so on have all taken their lives. When I was 19 and I had to see my father's body in a morgue at Glebe, I hope you don't mind me telling you this, but that for me was in fact the beginning of my activism. I don't know why, I can't explain to you how, but it somehow made me so conscious of my mortality. I was a suburban Sydney boy, Baptist, played soccer. I was also interested in guys and girls at the same time. I didn't even know about those things. It was and my family was basically very, very dysfunctional. And his death, in a sense, is what made my mind activated. And it's after that, in fact, that there's a whole story that develops through my life. And I was very fortunate, just as a content in this part of my answer, or my thoughts, is that last year I was one of the first keynotes in Australia at this National Suicide Prevention Conference in Hobart. There's this national conference that happens every year, and of course it affects a lot of Indigenous Australians, as you know. The highest incidence of suicide is amongst Indigenous Australians. In Tasmania, it's one of the highest. Western Australia, it's the second highest, I think. And I was very honoured to be asked as the very first human rights, I'm not a lawyer, by the way, either. My human rights is about thinking what it means to be human. It's about relationship. It's about respect and honouring, for example, that we're an Arakwal land, or how do we get along as human beings and not, bite each other or kill each other and so on. That's my kind of human rights, although I also do stuff in law. But last year I got to speak at this conference in Hobart, and it was like after all these years, 1977 was when my father took his life. It was 30 years pretty much, almost, since that time. And my brother took his life in Byron Bay in 2007, end of 2007. And the interesting thing for me is that understanding that suicide in my family was the result pretty much not just of mental health problems. In fact, it was about the fact that society itself is hugely dysfunctional in relation to all the things that I started to think about and care about. Disability, Aboriginality, what it means to be Australian, class, race, gender, sexuality. All these things, this soup of what we are as a society, became pretty much significant to me. And for me, and I know this might sound really odd to everybody here, but for me, the actual story that got me to that is, in fact, strangely enough, my father's suicide. One day I'll write about this, but I hope you don't mind me sharing that with you. But if I was to think about what activism is, it's to be alive, and it's to be awake. And it doesn't matter if you're at home and you're unable to do something on the street. Arundhati was saying it's about placards. She was thinking activism is the placard stuff. But activism, a novelist, for me, Michael Leunig, for goodness sake, is one of the greatest activists, I think, in the world, in Australia. He's one of our national activists. We should have a National Activist Day, Don't you think, Cathy? Anyway, sorry I hope you didn't mind me saying all that, but it's what brought me to Goonangary years ago. It's what I think about a lot every day. And I was honoured to be at that conference last year, in fact, because it brought all of this activism into a real kernel for me.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm quite interested. I'd like to come back to when you say the word activism and when you say the word activated, they sound really different to me. Like I get much more excited about what activated you than activism, so we might come back to that. What about for you, Cathy?
Oh, I found that very moving.
It was.
Baden, thank you for sharing that. And I found it very moving, actually, the thought of, we've seen the free hugs, but someone saying, what was it? I will listen, willing to listen. And actually was just confronting my own unwillingness to listen a lot of the time. So, for me, being an activist, it means taking some action. We then judge what the action should be. Is it big enough? Is it small enough? But I think it's anything that moves us in the direction of life and love and social transformation is being an activist. And that includes being willing to listen, because we live in a culture where we don't listen at all. And just that can be such a radical act of social change. So Yeah, that's what I think activism is.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of just touch on what I call lazy activism, which is a terrible word, but just one I made up. When people, like with the Coney campaign on Facebook, they like that, they support that cause, or they do this one, and some are successful, some aren't. So, and when you said we live in a society where we're not listening, we do seem to be a society where we spread the word very quickly via social media. Do you think that's a good thing for us or not, as a whole?
I don't know that it's good or bad. It is how it is now, so railing against it isn't going to make any difference. I love social media, as I'm sure most of us here do, and it is a great way to connect with information and find people that are your people. Find out about stuff that you may not have found out about, but you can get really involved in, like that little baby up in Brisbane, for instance, and how engaged we all were with that. And so, I don't know, I just think people start where they can start, right? So my first start was I turned up to a meeting. Like, that was the start. And someone else who'd done, whatever, could think, oh, that's all she did was turn up to a meeting. But for me, that was a really big thing. And in fact, lamely, the reason I turned up to the first peace group meeting is because I'd fallen in love with this guy who was older than me and he wanted to give back, right? And I had no interest in giving back whatsoever. And I just went there to make sure the hippies weren't getting into my boyfriend. And that is genuinely the truth. So, small steps, people, small steps. But I kept showing up. So I think the ability to show up and then show up again and then keep taking that thing is what it is. So maybe clicking that, whatever, or writing that petition is where we're at when we're busy, or I don't know. I just think part of being committed to sort of transforming social conditions on the planet for the better, I think that we just have to take judgment out of the equation and bring more sort of love and wholeheartedness to it, is what we need to do.
The problem can be, though, that I don't know how many other people share this, like, I never feel I'm doing enough. So you can beat yourself up and judge yourself as not doing enough, or, okay, I care about that, or I'm overwhelmed about Syria. So how do you choose where to put your energy, and how do you manage that in your head, say all the things you can't do?
Yeah, I'm really good at that, actually, because I'm masquerade as the laziest person that I know. So I sort of just want to do things well or not do them at all. So we chose me, my thing. So I know I can't do everything on causes, but I also think that I still try to be an amazing, loving, present human being, and I do think energetically that matters as well, even if I'm not, zillion things that you could be involved in. What I do say to people is choose something and get involved with it. And sometimes we get paralysed by choice. We spread ourselves too thinly, we don't end up succeeding at all. So I just think choose something. It may not be the right thing, and then you can choose something else, because that's the other thing. How do we choose between this or between that? And choose what calls you as well, or what calls you, or what you're called to. There's enough people in the world who are waking up to be our partners in life and in the world. And I just think we have to trust that as well. Otherwise, we're just running around, and then just from an energy perspective, if you're burnt out or tired, whatever, then you're not helping anything. So I should actually run a workshop on guilt, because even though I was raised as a Catholic and one of 7 children, and my husband can attest to this, I pretty much never experience it. So maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll do a Saturday workshop. I just don't experience it.
Now, you've both mentioned...
All right, Anita. So anyone else?
You both mentioned, you said to be an activist was to be awake, and you've mentioned about not sleeping. And I always find that phrase really exciting, that, don't go to sleep, like in life. So you mentioned that as well when you were talking. Can you talk through us a bit more about that?
Well, okay. But I think Cathy's got some really good points to already consider
Isn't he gorgeous?
put on the table, though, because listening is absolutely critical to this whole thing, and I don't think we are a listening culture. I absolutely 100% agree with that, and it's difficult to find spaces where you can actually have that listening, which is qualitatively good for the kind of things that you're talking about in terms of social change. And we need that. You know, it's about, in a sense, what nourishes the work we do, and how does it keep us going and not have fatigue and all that sort of business, and not running on empty. So what was your question again, Susanna?
Well, I was interested in, I wanted to ask what sustains you, and also how, because you seem such a giving person, how you, in your mind, process life so you're not overwhelmed by the need out there. And also I wanted to, in that, for you to touch upon the being awake, not sleeping.
There's a, I suppose, again going back to what Cathy was talking about, it's what calls to you in a sense, and you know, if you start to pay attention to the world and you start to look at it and you start to see it, it then behoves us to work out how to relate to it. To be awake for me, to be an activated human being, means it's not about FOMO, by the way. You know what FOMO means, everyone? Fear of missing out. That's the new social media thing. You've heard that, have you, Cathy? Have you heard
Please.
that? Yeah. Okay. I'm not talking about FOMO, so this is a different conversation to all of that we're talking about here. This is about the kind of thing that the Nobel writer Toni Morrison talked about once in an interview with Jana Wendt years ago. And she says, Toni Morrison wrote The Beloved, and she's amazing, African-American writer, and she said, in terms of racism, in terms of understanding the world, she doesn't want to blink. And I find that a very powerful way of thinking about what it means to be awake as well. It means that in my life, I guess in my life, I've wanted to understand the world I'm in, to relate to it, to be a part of it. There's a whole range of ethical protocols that I have to sort of, in a sense, develop. Listening, what it means to listen. That, for me, is about activating. What is a real activist is probably one of the questions we're asking, I suppose. What does it really mean to be an activist overall? Is it about a certain muscularity? And I mean that in the sense that is compassion something that comes from bearing witness? Is it something from, you get moved by something? Because we do need to be moved. To be moved is to be activated. Is it about understanding it in terms of language? Is it about what do we mean by action in these things? And I think one of the things that sustains me, Susanna, very much is the question always about within and without. That it's very, and again, I was a late bloomer. I discovered my sexuality when I was politicized. I became politicized in my 30s, so I was a late bloomer, I think. I bet you everybody in this room was much, I don't know, I could ask, don't put your hand up, don't worry. But I came to it in my 30s, and this was because of the suicide, it turned me inside. And so I was activated as a thinker, as a kind of, contemplating what this life is that we're in and so on, etc. And then because one can't help but, relating to others, this idea that we're all in the one, this idea of Ubuntu, that I'm a human being through you, and I only am human through my relationships, what defines me. In my 30s, I discovered that my sexuality was a politicised thing in Australia. I was, in a same-sex relationship. I never talked about it. It was something that I didn't visibilise, if it was. So to be activated in that sense was very important. And I think that's exactly the sort of moment that happened like you did with Joe, for example, Joe Valentine, all those early things you were doing with anti-uranium. For me, it came about by walking down, for example, George Street with 10,000 other LGBT people in Sydney in the 80s and feeling very, very different. You know, it's like it transforms the space of the city, of your life, etc. It enables you. So for me, the question of what enables myself to become an active human being has been my ongoing inquiry. How to do that. That's my human rights, in fact, if I was to be asked what that means, you know. And it means being a critical thinker, being a listener. And I think everything you said before was absolutely on the button, you know. We are Australia. We were a very privileged society, and we are absolutely, as Doris Lessing said when she came to Australia in 1992, you know, you Australians are so comfortable. You're all asleep. You know, you're all asleep. You're all you're in the zone. And when I came to Southern Cross, the first thing that the lecturer said in Southern Cross was, you know, you've come to the university where there's the palm tree syndrome. You know, everybody here is basically, out of it in a sense. But the thing is, my question again is, what is it that nourishes activism for me? What is activism? For me, again, it's about activating what is human. We don't even know what being human is, really, I don't think. We don't even know how to relate to the environment properly, let alone ourselves. So that relationship between myself, of who I am, and the world, to me, is the critical relationship. Am I, do I go on a protest and do something that's completely different to what I do at home? You know what I mean? That kind of division. So being conscious of that, being awake to that, being aware of that. And the fact is that we're always, in a sense, going to sleep. Everything turns us to... We're so distracted, you know, and social media is a good thing. I come from a human rights centre where we use it for everything. We used it for Baby Asher. We use it for a lot of asylum seeker actions. I think it's very important. That's communication. Communication is what we are as human beings. And every avenue is important to activate. But it's the quality again. It's the quality, and it's what is it, the essence of what it means to be to me again, what it means to be a human being.
Now, can I ask you to, because that's not so much theoretical, but I like the language. You're using some quite old-fashioned language, like bearing witness, your calling, which makes me feel all warm and fuzzy. But can you talk, both of you, a bit about your work and what you do in your chosen careers? Because you've chosen a career that, you know, we can look at and go, oh, it's easy for you to be an activist. But can you just run us through a bit of your day, maybe in a week, but just tell us some of the things you do, some of the decisions you're making, and maybe how those principles you've both been speaking about, how that informs how you work in your role.
Yeah, actually, I was going to give you... I'm also fascinated with how we turn ourselves on and turn others on. And in the work that we do at the Hunger Project, our mission is around the end of hunger. And when we first started, actually, in the 70s, obviously before my time, but it was such a radical act to even talk about that you could end hunger. And our whole approach is that the way that you're going to end hunger isn't through technical fixes or food drops. It's actually going to be deeply investigating what it means to be human and to unlock human creativity, entrepreneurialism and leadership from the poor so that they end their own hunger. So the whole thought of like the poor, like we see, in fact, when I first heard about the Hunger Project and this whole mission, it wasn't my mission. I was in green politics and, that stuff. And when Joe told me about ending hunger, I was like overwhelmed, and I thought, there's 1 billion mouths to feed, it's just too much. And I sort of put it to one side. And then when I had my first child, I remember holding her in my arms and just obviously loving her, and felt that connection to parents around the world who see their child die of diarrhoea, or mums who are dying 1 per minute in childbirth, and these are consequences and real effects from chronic hunger. So that was sort of like how I then sort of found my way into that path. But what I find, the example that I wanted to give actually is around this whole notion of activating. And in our work, we call people who are activated, we call them animators, as in to give life, right? You're an animator, not the drawer, but the give life. And we've trained more than 400,000 of the poorest of the poor around the world to take leadership actions in their own villages to end their own hunger and the hunger of their communities. And this is like so pioneering, because when you think of, and our approach is we start with the mindset. And what I love, and that's why I wrote the book, is we're all humans. So the same kind of approach, mindset, people who live in villages, they're resigned, they've been done over, they're dependent, they're cynical, they're feeling, you know, all of this stuff. And we're like that too. We don't see any hope for a better future, particularly, you know, in our. We might personally think you're going to have a nice life, but we're resigned. We don't think our lives matter. We don't think we have a voice at the table when decisions are getting made. So this sort of human dynamic, we think it's sort of different over there in a village, or we're all asleep, we're all resigned, and we're all dead, waiting to die, basically, except there's a few of us who are not, and that's terrific. So our approach is how do you systematically wake up people to take concerted effort? And I'm talking about the poorest of the poor. And when you think about it, a woman has, so just imagine, you know, you're a family, you know, whatever gender or whatever you are, in a village, you've always been hungry. So your past is one of hunger. You're hungry now, and your future just looks like more of that, right? Does that make sense? And so any action or non-action that you take in the present moment is predicated upon your belief that nothing's going to change. And that is just the way, and you just wait for government handouts or whatever, or you don't know what to do. And so our approach is firstly impacting that mindset with a very clear, and we only have local people working there, so it's not me, white Aussie girl in a village in Burkina Faso. We only have Burkina Babes, they're called, which is such a great name, working in that country, and it's my absolute privilege that I get to work with them and learn from them and spend time with them. So it's their own people talking about the possibility, actually, that hunger could end. Just the possibility is the first step. And people can almost not conceive of that. They've got all the reasons why not to, and it's a very detailed approach that we do called the Vision, Commitment and Action Workshop. It's incredibly powerful. So there's this interruption in the mindset that I don't matter and I can't make a difference. And then from that, people create a vision for their lives free from hunger. They commit to it. So we have a whole section around committing. Because commitment's like the bit that we may all have visions, right? To let's, you know, have solar power across the world or whatever. And then we kind of work out an action, but the key piece is around committing. And commitment's another one of those daggy old words, right? Who talks about commitment now? No one talks about commitment. But you need to commit first to yourself and then to what it is that you're up to. We have a whole process around that. And then what actions are you going to take in line with your commitment to fulfil your vision? And that's what communities around the world, we impact about 21 million people, and we are talking rural, remote, India, Bangladesh, Africa, Latin America. This isn't urban areas and that sort of stuff. And they have been my greatest teachers, and this is where I draw hope and energy from, Susanna, because, and I love to then share this back with us, because how do we wake ourselves up? We also need to be sort of consciously choosing to do it and to help animate others. Because otherwise we can't just, as you're talking about the palm, I didn't quite get what that meant, palm leaves, although I think maybe I got it.
Palm tree syndrome it's called.
Yeah, I know, but this sort of, wafty sort of stuff. So I love the fact that we can wake up that woman. So here's an example of someone who was like that. So she, her name is Rihanna, and I met her in Bangladesh. And she was a young woman, no education, very low social standing, and the Hunger Project started doing this sort of activation in her area, and she started turning up to meetings. a little self-help group was set up. So a whole bunch of women, about 20 women, would meet each week just to talk about, support each other on this new vision that they had, that maybe hunger could end in our community and we could play a role in that. And they used to put aside a fistful of rice. This is what they committed to, of dry rice every day, which sometimes all you're eating is one bowl of rice with some fried chilies and onions on. So it's a really investment. And that each week, so you'd have like this pile throughout the week, and each week you would go and all the women would have their rice, so there'd be a larger pile, and would be sold, and then there'd be a few local tucker, it's called, and everyone then gets a chance each week to buy something that can generate income. And she bought chicken and looked after them, ended up buying a little cow and just started to get on her way, and she was really proud, and with economic independence. Again, there's no handouts here. What's powerful about this story is that it's liberating the resources within a community, both at a personal level and at an economic level. Anyway, she started to look to see what else is happening in my village, because I've made a commitment to end hunger here. And she found out that her 12-year-old female cousin was about to be married. Now, child marriage is illegal there, but it's widely practiced. And one of the drivers for it is money. Because the younger a girl is and the less educated she is, the less dowry her family has to pay to get her married. So it just makes sense. And if you were there in a village with no money, we'd all be doing it as well. And that's, I think, gets back to that sort of love and seeing ourselves in each other. Anyway, she thought, no way is this girl going to get married while I'm living and breathing. And she marched down there and said, you can't marry this girl. And this is Rihanna, who only like a year earlier had no voice, she's still in her early 20s. Basically, the family said, get nicked, this is not happening, And she really thought about it. And then she went to the imam, who's the religious leader, and said, you're marrying this girl, you can't marry this girl. That takes huge courage. And he went down to the family and he talked to them, and he came back to her and he said, this still has to go ahead, they're just insisting on it. And so then she actually grabbed about 10 or so women from her self-help group and went to the police, who are no friends of the poor, but using her legal right, said you cannot have this marriage go ahead. And the police went down and stopped the marriage. And I was there 2 years later, and that girl was 14 and still not married. And the thing that so moves me about that is this is someone who we don't think has leadership capacity, or we've got to do something for them, or isn't their society terrible? I don't know, this sort of stuff that we think about ourselves. So this whole process of how do we wake us up, how do we activate, how do we take a stand for what is important to us, and then take the requisite action and support others to do it, and support each other in love, I think is a really fundamental, crucial issue of our time. And I really appreciate that we have this chance tonight to talk about it. I know many of you are amazing activists and could easily share stories, but I really wanted to give that approach from our Vision, Commitment and Action workshop that, as I said, 400,000 people around the world have done, nearly 5 million have done the VCA, and we've trained up 400,000 into workshops that go for at least 4 days of coming into their sense of leadership, and that change it won't just happen, it needs to be made to happen if it's going to happen in the way that we want to. So that was a really long answer.
That was a great answer. Thank you. That's very inspiring. I feel like I need a cup of tea now.
I know, we need to have like a group hug and then like a powwow discussion.
Oh, no, that was a beautiful story, actually. Baden, what about you? How does your work...
Okay, so, first of all, that is an amazing story that you just said, and I think there's lots of things that also I could respond to, particularly in terms of, again, this idea, it's the mindset. A lot of it's mindset. And one of the things I think about, thinking about what we do as activists, is we often get caught in cul-de-sacs. That is cul-de-sacs of what we're concerned about. And one of the reasons why I was so inspired by people like Desmond Tutu is that he could see that. So I asked him, I was sat on that couch, so I'm returning to that couch for a moment. So picture me with Desmond Tutu, and he's full regalia. He's actually on the weekend, so he's got his African garb, and I'm as nervous as anything, sitting next to this fellow. And one of the things and I said, so what are you concerned about most of all? And he said, after apartheid's been finished, And he said, well, number one, I think, is to end poverty. That was the number one thing. So the work that Cathy's talking about and that she does, and that kind of extraordinary transformation that happens at the mindset in villages and places is really the tangible end of this particular kind of continuum of activism. When I lived in India, for example, we knew people who were so poor, so thin, like the waist, for example, of one of the people that we knew that worked in the gardens was so thin, so small, it was just staggering to us from Australia. And what was very interesting talking to him was the fact that there was never anything beyond tomorrow, like you were talking about. So there's this idea that you get caught into that trap that there's nothing beyond because you're basically in survival mode and so on. But this question of what it means to be activated in that way, for me, in a sense, is choiceless. It's almost like, for me, when I think about becoming awake or being an activist or activating something, it's in a sense, I know it sounds strange, but it's a choiceless thing. You see something in front of you and you have to act. You have to do something. It can be about hunger, but it can be about apartheid, racism. It can be about the fact that we don't fully respect Indigenous Australia. It can be about disability. It can be about gender. It can be about all these different age, everything. We know this sort of stuff. What I absolutely loved about Desmond Tutu, and it was something that really made that idea of what activism or being activated is very profound for me, is that he could transfer. He was interested in the fact that poverty was something you had to do, but he also understood that there was a thing called what he called homosexual apartheid. That was his second concern after poverty, homosexual apartheid. And you might all think that's really strange. This is in 1999. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, the apartheid against LGBT people. He's an archbishop in the Anglican Church. He's from South Africa. He's this extraordinary man. And he's just fought racism, 101, absolutely. And he said, that apartheid, that homosexual apartheid is the same as the apartheid in relation to race. So one of the things I think is really important that I've come to think about very much in the work I do is, in a sense, learning about, communicating, thinking about how, in fact, we need to understand that there's a whole range of different... being an activated human being actually means being, in a sense, quite holistic. I know that term sounds terrible too, in a sense that it's an old term. But it means, in fact, understanding that any sense of social exclusion, any kind of lack of respect for the environment, any sense of marginalisation of others, the notion that there are others, in fact, all these things are hugely violent. They're destructive. They are, in a sense, completely antithetical to what it might mean to be a human being. So this understanding of how to apply, of how to respond to the world, whether it's through, in relation to hunger, in relation to disability, in relation to, the kind of terrible situation in Australia about Indigenous, that the kind of what I call the ongoing colonialism against Indigenous Australia that we still exist in. All these things are a part of the same kind of thing. So the mindset. So what is this mindset that Cathy and I, in our work, and all of, I would say everybody here, what are we doing with that? What is the mindset? What is the thing that we try to nourish, that we try to perpetuate, that we try to energise, and I think these are the sorts of things that I do in my work. I've been a teacher at Southern Cross I was a teacher at Southern Cross for about 20 years. There's a number of students I can see in this room, by the way. Again, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up at all. No, it'd be interesting. But the kind of approach to understanding how to be activated is probably one of the most important questions that we can engage in. How to be activated. And it can be done in so many different ways. There's no formula for activism. What Cathy and I do in our jobs, which are very different in many ways, are in different, we're doing things in different contexts. But in a sense, just listening to Cathy, I can see so much resonance in terms of the sorts of concerns and the kind of approach. And for me, for example, it is about a choiceless response, actually, in the end. How can I, as a privileged, Australian, sit back and not act intellectually, creatively, emotionally, in all the ways that I can to respond to the fact that I live in a world which is basically full of zombies, zombie capitalism, appalling deafness to the kind of hunger that exists, the 59 million refugees who are displaced on the planet at the moment, the stuff that happens every single day in our news, that can in some ways paralyse us, that can overwhelm us. But one of the things I've found over my career is that probably one of the most important things is not to blink, is in fact to be shocked, to be shocked by what is happening, to be outraged, and not to be outraged just in terms of just, and again, I agree, be absolutely outraged. It's shocking. In Western Australia, we're just having the 25th anniversary of the deaths in custody next month, and my centre will be working with the Equal Opportunity Commission to host a series of events and that sort of thing. And the kind of deep racism in this country is so profound, it's hard to believe that, it is in our everyday lives. And we walk around in Australia just by the good grace of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters in many, many ways. So we need to be outraged, but we also need to be, in a sense, understanding that to be activated is a choiceless thing. What I mean by that is we face these problems. We face the problem of hunger. What are we going to do? Choose to... In a sense, my question would be, can I choose to ignore that? What gives me that position to choose to ignore that? So for me, for example, just to bring it back to my own personal story in terms of my career, when I discovered that, my sexuality was a problem, my mother said, by the way, I tried to take my life because my mother said, why were you born? You shouldn't have been born. Now, when people say to you, you shouldn't be born, it's a problem, yes? and that took me a long time to come to terms with. But what's interesting in my career is that I've pursued this question of how do we get to that point where the Europeans come to this country and say, well, you shouldn't have this. How does it get to my mother saying you shouldn't be born? How do we get to a position where inequality is the rule, the thumb in the world, that so few people own the vastest amount of wealth in the world? So the work that Cathy does is palpable human rights activist stuff. The very working of that, very much about survival of food. So this notion of what activates us has been my single most important focus in my career. And the kind of work that I've, in a sense, just as an example, come to do is in terms of enabling. And I'm not saying... I don't know. I don't have any answers, by the way. I have more questions than answers, as you probably can see. But one of my kind of questions always is about how do we enable? If it's choiceless for me to be a part of this, if I cannot ignore it, I can't blink, how do I respond? How do I enable it? Enable myself as well as enable others to actually respond to this particular crisis. And I've got one example. One of the students I had at Southern Cross University was a cerebral palsy student who used to come to Lismore campus in the most muscular fashion, right up Military Road. She ignored all of the sorts of university warnings, and that it was illegal for her to go on the road. And of course, she said the only way she could actually access the university was going right up the road, up there like that, every day from her house in Lismore. And this particular student of mine, who had been born with cerebral palsy, came to university because she was also in a world where people questioned her value, her worthwhileness as a human being. How? In an everyday sense, because nothing was accessible. Things were made for an ableist society. So it wasn't you or I saying to her, you know, why do you exist? It was the fact that society itself is unfriendly to people with disabilities. How do you actually... So she's queer too, by the way. And she'd been somebody who'd also struggled with her sexuality, being a cerebral palsy person, and she learned, she was enabled through thinking about how to activate, how to respond to the world by the kinds of conversations that we're having now. This is education. So for me, that's my career. That's been my career. To activate is to educate, to self-educate and to educate. And it's one movement.
Thank you. Now, before we ask if you've got any questions, we did say that part of the talk was seeking justice in a world of growing inequality. So I just wanted your opinion, because I'm actually not sure, and I know you work in different fields. Is global equality getting better or getting worse? Or is that just a question I can't assess? No, just because of how you work and what you see. What's your opinion on that before I ask for questions?
Well, just in relation to hunger and poverty, it's getting better. Is that a surprise? So so for instance, in 1992, nearly 19% of the world lived in the classification for hunger and poverty, which was below I can't remember what it was in 1992, let's say it was $1 a day. And now, even though we've added nearly 2 billion people, it's just under 11%. So we are making progress, and I think that's part of the thing that we think we don't, and that continues to add and build despair. But actually, before I answer that, go into further, I want to sort of I agree, but kind of also don't with this choiceless thing. Because I actually think, I think taking a stand for change involves a choice. And many of us see stuff in the world, and information and being aware of it and seeing it on our TV and being horrified of it, if that was the catalyst for change, we'd have change. So there's something that is in the way of taking that action, and it isn't just that there's nothing else I could do and therefore I'm going to do it. I actually think we have a very definite ability to choose to be involved or not involved, to see or not see, and we make those choices throughout the day. And some, I choose to not be involved in certain things and I choose to be involved in others. But I think there's power in actually saying, up with this, I will no longer put, and taking that. And that's actually what happened to me. So many ins and outs. I ended up in Ethiopia in 1992, and it wasn't that long after the Live Aid, the terrible famine of the mid-80s. And I was there because Steve and I had had our first child, and someone spoke to us about the Hunger Project, and we wanted to be involved, and we were asked to give a lot of money, and we didn't have money. And that was really the first choice. I could have said, no, I can't afford it, but we worked out how to do it, to have this sort of, I felt very called to take this next step on my leadership. And there was about 10 of us there, and really Steve and I were the only ones standing. So again, it comes down to choice and who you're going to be in the matter. Life throws us many opportunities to engage, and you need to choose or not choose. And as I said, there's lots of things I don't choose to be involved in. But we ended up in this little Jeep, and we're driving from Addis Ababa through to these villages called Go to Chile, just tiny few little huts. And in fact, driving there, we drove over parts of the Rift Valley, and the driver said we're driving over the valley, through the Valley of Death. And I said, well, what's that? And he said that basically 100,000 people had died there just 5-7 years earlier, and millions of people had been on the move looking for water and food, and had walked into the valley but couldn't walk out, mainly women and children. So then I drive, and we get to this collection of huts, and I get out, and I've never been in a village before, and I'm just a girl from Perth and just had a baby, and what do I know? Nothing. And was my first interaction with people that live in hunger and poverty, and it was horrific and frightening. Not frightening as in I was scared for my life, but just horrifying to see how people live. And there were women who were meeting us and holding babies, and they had their breasts open and their shirts off, and the baby's chewing on the end, but there's no milk there. And we walked around the hut, and I nearly tripped over this man, and I found out through my interpreter that he was willing himself to die to not be a burden on his community. And I felt this incredible sense of separation. I know we theoretically share planet Earth, but I didn't feel any connection with these people at all, and the babies and the women. I felt like I'd come in from another planet. And what was really hard is that I couldn't pretend it was just happening here and not happening anywhere else. There was more than 1 billion people at that time who lived like this. And to your point, and our part of the organisation is that the huge work is how do we expand our circle of love and care and activism to actually include the 1 billion of us that we've set aside we've discarded, basically. And of course that's then a whole thing of what parts of ourselves have we also discarded, because at that end of the day, and I can say this in federal, there is no out there, there's just here. Anyway, so the tribal chief gets us together and welcomes us, and Lynn, who was leading the trip, and I've now done this more than 30 times myself, but she said, we're from the Hunger Project, and we're committed to bringing about the end of hunger, and we're not here to give you anything, because we're not an aid organisation, but we're to hear your voice, we're here to meet you and learn from you and take you out into the world on our mission to end hunger. And I had my sunglasses on, and I was thinking that's so lame. I was really judging her, thinking that's pathetic. Try not to cry, and all the Africans were like standing there just, like normal, and I'm just sort of trying to hold it together. Anyway, the chief said this thing that changed my life. He welcomed us, and he said, we don't want anything anyway, but if our living and dying means that others don't have to live and die like us, then our lives will be worth it. And I can't remember anything else that happened that day in the village. And we went back to this little shack, and there was just a few mattresses on the floor and nothing else. And everyone got upset. We had biscuits, we had milk, we had stuff, and we didn't do anything. All we did was talk, and And Lynn just held up her hand, and she said, A, they didn't want anything, but B, you are only giving to make yourself feel better and to trick yourself into thinking that you've made a difference today when you have not. And in fact, to make yourself feel a little bit better about what you've seen. And I won't let you do that. And what there is to do is to keep your promise to these people and go out into the world and be their partners in ending hunger. And that was the choice that I made. And beautifully supported over years of never being at home with my son, my husband, and now my son's here as well. But I made that stand, and 10 others didn't. So they've probably gone on and done other stuff. So that's not so much about that, but I just want to call us to awareness around the power of taking a stand and choosing something and actually committing to it and making something happen is power. And then there's also, in many ways, I didn't feel I almost had a choice. So there's that choice. There's that thing of like, it chose me and I didn't kind of choose it either. So that's why I was sort of agreeing with you, but also I do think...
It's a paradox.
It is a paradox.
Yeah, and I totally think that's another good example of the whole thing, because in an instrumental sense, we always choose what we need to face. If you're in an apartheid system, racism is going to be the thing you go for. I guess the thing I was, in a sense, thinking about in terms of the choicelessness of it is that, and it's Desmond Tutu's kind of way in a sense, is that when we, it's like love. It's kind of like, it's a bit like what you're talking about, exactly what it's a paradox, Cathy. And how can you actually say, I choose, if there's love, there's love. You can't actually say, it is choiceless, actually. Isn't it? I think it is. And that's, to me, the heart of an activist, in fact. Yes, we can only do what we can do. I choose things all the time, absolutely. And that's, in that kind of everyday sense, absolutely. But I think you're actually hitting it on the table again, very much, like you said at the very beginning, about listening and everything. I think that we're always facing this question about what to respond to. But at heart, to me, it is a choiceless thing. So it's what comes before us in the everyday. So if we're, like my cause might be to assist asylum seekers and refugees, to help them particularly. In my job at the moment, it's very strongly that focused. But at the same time, in my everyday life, how do I respond to the kind of stuff that happens every day, which is so complex? It happens everywhere. So it's kind of like
it's a paradox.
It is a paradox.
I feel like there's so much more in that. But I would like to see if anyone's got a question for Cathy or Baden or both of them. Can I remind you not to get up and make a statement, but to have a question, because I know everyone would have so many stories to tell, and I'm aware of the time. So if you've got a question, Al's got the microphone there. Can you tell us your name too?
Yep, Sandy Gilmore from Goonangarry. We often associate people who are committed to causes or what have you with being almost extreme to some degree, or they're prepared to...
Hold the microphone, please.
Or they're prepared to compromise their family lives or their community and social interactions. I mean, this is a question for both of you. Do either of you feel that, or is it something you've had to work on combating, or, presumably people work it out and their lives become more balanced?
So your question there is how they've come to terms with their taking action?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because our role models all get assassinated, or, terrible things happen to them. So you can't really think of anyone that you admire that was still alive and lived beautifully into their old age, right? So yeah, there's not a lot of good role models. But I don't know, I always felt that I could choose my own things, so, but I have been supported by an amazing partner and family.
Yeah, and that's very important. I mean, you need that sort of support, but I think you have to be dangerous and you have to be extreme in many ways. And the kind of work we do, in a sense, is extreme. I mean, and it reminds me, for example, of Michael Kirby, just for a moment. You know Michael Kirby, the Justice? Yeah. He's an extreme fellow. But he wears a tie and a jacket, and he's very, very proper, and all that sort of stuff. But when he was on the High Court, I asked him, how was it on the High Court for those 10 years? Because he was the longest-serving High Court judge, and he was regarded as the progressive, all that stuff. He's out there, all that sort of, trying to change Australian society in so many different levels. And he said every single judge, bar one, hated him. Every single judge on that High Court hated him and hated his decisions and hated him. And I said, Michael, how do you deal with that? And he said, I kill them with charm.
That's a good
answer. And in a sense, the kind of work that we do, I mean, the work that I do, particularly in the human rights field, which is extreme in many ways, Sandy. I mean, and we have a lot of Indigenous actions in Western Australia at the moment. We have a lot of stuff to do with refugees and asylum seekers, and it's very much about those passions and that kind of, we're dealing with a culture, as Cathy said, that doesn't listen and so on. So you have to use different ways of being dangerous. Being an activist is being alive and being awake ought to be something that you take risks with. Would you say, Cathy? There's always risk-taking in what we do. And the fact is, to take a risk means you learn the different strategies, the different ways, the different avenues, the different articulations and expressions of how to be a radical. And I think Michael Kirby's a very good example. So is Michael Lunig, actually. And there's a lot of examples of that sort of thing. Melissa Lukashenko, the local Midjabel Ukrainian writer, Indigenous writer here on the North Coast. She
spoke at a FedTalks last year.
One of the most radical people in this country. She would never go to university to be an academic because she feels that that would be a prison to her kind of activism because of the language. So she's learned to write through that, in that sense, Alan, how to communicate. She would say to be an activist is to be a dangerous individual. Well, what do we mean by that? I think it just means someone who sees that we're in a prison. We're in a prison of inequality, and a prison, and I'm not sure I think the whole thing about if we're getting better, I'm not someone who buys in so much into that kind of progressive history sort of thing. In some ways, yes. It's very important what Cathy was talking about in terms of the changes to hunger and poverty, because in many parts of the world, in fact, things have been changing quite remarkably. And in fact, even in Australia, suicide's been going down in certain places because of certain programs and certain ways. There are always those sorts of things that happen. But my point of view is one can never blink. As an activist, you have to always be diligent. You have to always, in a sense, be conscious of the fact that there is no, in a sense, what do we mean by progress? For goodness sake. I'll tell you an amazing story. This is incredible. You know, I live here I'm not here at the moment, but I live here. My home's in Ocean Shores. I've lived in Goondigarry for 10 years. I know this area very well since 1992. And of course, I was one of those people who's very happy about the 99% don't, the CSG stuff. Yes? I bet you everybody in this room, 99%? 100%? Maybe? Do I hear 100% yet? 110% maybe. But I go to Narrabri quite often to visit a friend's mum. And over there, when you go to the cinema, you're welcomed by Santos at the cinema. And in fact, the credo around there is in fact, more often than not, the complete opposite of here. And there are activists there for that. So what do we mean by activism is very significant. Because activism, of course, doesn't mean just social change for its better. I mean, I could say so much about this, but in a sense, I think we can never not be vigilant. That's my sense. We can never not be vigilant. Statistics might get better for us. We might get marriage equality, perhaps. But, marriage equality has happened in the United States. But did you know, for example, Michigan just outlawed sodomy, for example. So there's this very interesting kind of contradiction that occurs everywhere. And we live in this kind of world of contradictions and paradoxes. And so I don't know if that answers the question very much, but I think vigilance is very, very important, Sandy.
Thank you. Do we have time for another question now? Yep.
You're not allowed to say you love your wife.
Thanks, Alan. I love you, Cathy. To what extent do both of you feel that democracy is a positive and a negative in the work that you do? I'm thinking of your CSG example, and I'm thinking of a lot of idiotic causes and kinds of mentalities that are very, very heavily fear-based. Yeah.
Who wants to tackle that one first? Democracy.
Yeah, well, the work that we do, local democracy, is the third pillar. So there's women, mindset shifting and local democracy, meaning having people have some say about the decisions that affect their own lives at a governmental level. And most countries in the world have some version of a functioning democracy, wouldn't be maybe what we call it. So it's very key from that perspective. That said, Uganda's just going through elections at the moment. It's a country that I've spent a lot of time in, and I was there 5 years ago when they had their last lot of elections, and one of my mentors and women that I love very much used to be the former Vice President of Uganda, and now she's the UN Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS for Africa. And she was really spruiking for Museveni, the president, who's been there for 25 years. He's a bit of a dictator, not quite, but you know, he mobilised the army to get people to rallies, and if you're a reporter and you reported that there were less than 500 people at a rally, even if there were, then you would be arrested, and you know, he's a bit of a dick basically. And I said to her, why are you supporting him? Isn't it time for a change? And she looked at me and she said, Cathy, sometimes peace is more important than democracy. And you know what? She's right. So, that said, I believe in the democratic principle and everything like that, but I just think there is a hierarchy of needs.
And what about you? What do you like with democracy?
Well, that's a big question.
It's a massive
Huge
question, Steve.
I mean, democracy is a complex system which is full of lots of problems. It is relative, as Cathy's just pointed out, from country to country. I mean, Indonesia stays together as a, you know, ostensibly on the same basis in a sense, and peacefulness is one of the things that it prides itself on. Stability is the thing, right? So again, what do we mean by democracy is the question I would ask, and in the sense that for me, democracy in Australia at the moment is what we know of democracy. If we think about it as a kind of muscular place that diversity exists, and we protect those people who are the minorities. That's how a democracy is supposed to actually work, is how it protects those that are vulnerable in some ways. That's one version. Is, you know, Australian democracy itself is under threat at the moment by so many different, you could say, so many laws, legislation, you know, the kind of things that are happening here. I can't remember who it was the other day that said Australia was one of the worst, someone may know here, it was in the papers, was one of the worst places to, I don't know if it was Noam Chomsky who wrote about this, but it was someone the other day said Australia is one of the worst places for democracy at the moment because of the kind of
I find that very hard to believe.
Yeah,
because I love Noam, but
because of the kind of legislation that's coming in relation to what can be reported, the kind of laws that are occurring in terms of freedom of information. There is an attack in terms of that kind of sense of, you know, media expression, and the media being a place that is part of that kind of very healthy democracy. On the other hand, Indonesia is a place that has a very healthy media, and you could say it's actually a very healthy democracy in that sort of sense. So again, I don't have any sort of fixed answer to that at all, except to say that I think we have to look very carefully at what a democracy might mean.
Okay, do we have time for another one? I'm just aware people have been sitting still for a long time.
On the democracy issue, my name's Michael Weatherhead, by the way. On the democracy issue, at the last federal election, I was voting in Mullumbimby, and I went up to the woman running the electoral booth there and asked her if we could have a suggestion box, because we're celebrating democracy today and I'd like to communicate with my government. She said, you'll have to take that up with someone else. I said, can't you even tell your manager? No, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'd be interested in your comments.
yeah, I don't have a comment. I mean, if that's your thing, then you can make it happen. I don't know. I've got nothing. Yeah, but so is your kind of point that she was the receptacle for your good idea, that perhaps you didn't actually want to action yourself, and now you're a little bit annoyed that she didn't jump at your great idea. Am I hearing that right? People give me their good ideas all the time. It used to be Madonna. You should speak to Madonna. It's like, okay. I don't know what to do with that, but, you know. But in terms of choosing leadership, that could be something, it's a great idea. You could next time you have a vote, you could have your own... I'm not going to solve it for you. I'm digging myself out of this one.
Can you help Cathy out of her hole over there?
No. It is a good idea, though.
That's a good idea.
At the back.
Hi, my name is Zunke. I think with a lot of social justice activism and a bit in the conversation today, we had a focus on disadvantage, whether it's in terms of hunger, whether it's in terms of exclusion, and in terms of making the world a better place, that we put a lot of time and attention in those places. I wanted to ask the panel what they thought about the role of privilege and the role of looking at and challenging privileges in addressing social injustice and inequality.
So is addressing the role of privilege doing something for social justice?
Yeah.
It's another biggie.
Yeah, well, again, I think that's kind of like the 101 about choicelessness. We are privileged, absolutely. And where privilege is, it ought to be the problem is the privilege. In fact, you know, it's not a black problem. In Australia, it's not a black problem. It's a white problem. That kind of thing. Yes, I mean, I fully think that the responsibility to be active, to not blink, to activate that kind of ability to connect and to relate and to have respect and all that sort of stuff, and to find something like Cathy said that you actually pour yourself into, is acknowledging that privilege. I mean, privilege is something that it's a complex thing, Zunke. I mean, it's in everything. Again, it goes back to that student of mine who is in a wheelchair. That's the thing. She sees a world in which she does not have the same privileges that everybody else does. And everyone in this room, all of us at some point are going to be old people. We're going to find the same thing happen. We're going to find our privileges are, in a sense, curtailed, yes? So we all face this stuff all the time in different contexts. So I would say, yes, we eat food, we're happy, we've got all that sort of stuff.
Actually, the way that I kind of cut into privilege is around money. So after being in Ethiopia, I came back and I was a volunteer for like 5 years. And I really wanted to do something, and I realised actually it needs to be around money. And as soon as you start talking about money, other than if you give 10 cents here or $5 there or whatever, it's like even now some of your buttocks are clenching right now. Like we just have this thing about money, especially if we're going to have to give it. And it brings up all of our own mindset around scarcity. We don't have it. And then so part of our work has been around actually we didn't have to lobby the government to get, the law changed so that I could go to school, so understanding the matrix of privilege but also opportunity that we stand on, and that our economic situation is tied into that, and the decisions that we make around our money are in a small vortex around looking at other people who are privileged rather than the broader whole. And I don't mean like you've got so much, so sort of give it to someone over there. It's actually looking at our own mindset around money and actually seeing, because actually our way of raising money is that we don't do panhandling kind of give us thing. We actually ask people, we call it invest, and quite significantly, as a way of kind of cutting through the ideology that we don't have enough and we need it for ourselves, and the spending of it will make us happy. And all of those three things are not true. So telling the truth about money actually was really liberating for me as an activist around ending hunger. Because the other way that we sort of turned it into was, yes, the money is going to go over there and help build more leaders like Rihanna that you heard, but it's not that I give money and I'm going to be less than and something over there will happen, but actually the experience of experiencing myself as the truth about who I am and what I have in the world is transformative for me even before the money gets spent. So I think the intersectionality of money and privilege and voice, and actually lovingly telling the truth with each other. We're all smelling farts and thinking it smells like roses, and actually, you know what, it doesn't. We're all telling this lie that we don't have time, enough money, enough love, enough what, which actually also stops us from engaging with what it is. So I definitely think that it isn't the thing about let's solve some problem over there and we're somehow unchanged as a result. And at the Hunger Project, the founding president actually said this thing that I found so inspiring, that the end of hunger, which hopefully we'll get to by 2030, which we could do another Fed talk on, it won't just be this world minus hunger. It will have to be a completely different world for us to have engaged ourselves as human beings and human citizens to bring that about and include the 7 billion in there, to your point at the beginning about who we are as human beings. We'll need to have tackled and addressed and begun to transform some of those key issues that we all hold stuff in place. So,
but can I just add to that too, that in a sense too, for me, privilege is very much about not seeing what is going on. That, you know, we are, just to talk about Australia, we are, for all intents and purposes, we live in a white privileged society where we don't see. We're like that idea of being the goldfish in the invisible discrimination against everything else sort of thing. So privilege can be an absolute, privilege is a prison as much as it is something, of course, that we can talk about in other ways, but it's a prison as well, yeah.
So what I've heard you both say tonight is we need to wake up, need to not blink, we need to be dangerous, we need to see what we're called to and what calls us. And hearing both of you speak, a lot of it was quite emotional to hear because it was all about in here. Like Cathy, several things you touched on was like you had to overcome your own feelings to be able to act. So quite deep personal things, and obviously what you've said about suicide and that's a signature of your family. You've had to overcome that. So what you haven't said, but I take from both of you, is that you seem to have an incredible amount of awareness also to be an activist, because you can talk about money, you can talk about all the different things, but when your stuff comes up, you've got to be able to deal with that. Otherwise, you're not going to be much help if you can't deal with, you know, if you're dealing with poverty and you don't like, it's a bit dirty, you've got to get over that. So I think you also maybe, I don't know if you two agree, you need courage as well, because you're both doing amazing work, and I feel privileged just knowing you're out there doing that work. I think it's fantastic, which is not a cop-out, but I just think knowing people like you two do what you do makes me feel really, really good. And I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank you for being here tonight. Thank you. Don't forget, you can do your bit and buy Unlikely Leaders, written by Cathy Burke, and it's got some of those stories like, I will never forget the woman with her rice, her hand of rice. Apparently they're up the back.
They're at the back at the table back here. Thank you to all the three people on the stage, Cathy, Susanna and Baden. Thanks for coming, and I know you're busy, and thank you all, and that's great.
Thank you.